Okay, I think Brian, now we are yours, and I don't think we need to I don't need to introduce you to other people, and you know everybody here, so we don't need to do introduction.
Okay, sounds great. Me. Huh. I think this will do it. All right. Can you see my screen? Great. All right. Sounds good. Thanks. So this is my presentation on two opposing views of teacher professionalism: institutionalism versus an ontological fiduciary agent. And in many ways, this is autobiographical about me becoming professional and really understanding these notions of professionalism. There's four components of professionalism that I want to focus on. The first one is professional as a fiduciary agent, which I'll get into briefly in an upcoming slide. Professionals also have expertise in their field. They have trusted discretion, and there's two things there. One, the discretionary decisions that they make are trusted, but also that within the organization or possibly the institution, there is this discretionary space that's protected so that the professionals can operate in there with their discretionary decisions. And the fourth component I want to focus on is that professionals engage in honest dialogue about the practice within the professional community and act as advocates for the profession outside of the community as well. Okay. All right. So institutionalists would define professionalism as compliance with the standards set by the institution in accordance with the authorities of that institution. Sorry, I'm having a little there. Okay. Sorry, I was having a little difficulty with the controls with Zoom. I reject this definition of institutionalist professionalism. Instead, I view professionals as a fiduciary, and I excerpted this from Eugene's writing, where he defines a fiduciary is defined by the fiduciary, usually an expert in the field, as helping the beneficiary choose the best course of actions suited to the beneficiary's interests and goals. The teacher's pedagogical fiduciary duty to their students is to recognize and respect that the student is the final authority of their own education and life. My thesis is that institutionalist administrators systematically deprofessionalize teachers through a series of steps. The first is that they supplant teachers' discretion and moral concerns about their practice with technical compliance. Administrators then assume authority of the technical knowledge of best practices. And once administrators assume this authority, then they command the narrative of what professional is and can evaluate teachers based on this technical understanding of professional practice. As a result, teachers are subordinated to administrator control, and the teacher as a fiduciary is suppressed. It's because now the teacher is acting in accordance with the administrator's desires as opposed to the students. So responsibility for the welfare of students as unique individuals with emerging and diverse needs and desires evaporates as the practice of good teaching is institutionalized as an objective, standardized technical practice. And once this whole system takes hold, a teacher who tries to act as a professional against the system, and so that explicitly advocate for acting as and prioritize being a responsible fiduciary for the students, they will have the institutional forces used against them because they're a threat to this system and the administrators or anybody else who's invested in it. So my journey as a teacher, as a novice teacher, I came into the profession with two major goals that I can identify. One is to be helpful to my students in attaining the success that they're seeking. The other is to become more capable of providing a rigorous, valuable experience for my students by becoming an authority in my subject area. In my first year as a teacher, I was assigned to teach 2 sections of advanced placement U.S. history, psychology, sociology, European history, which was ancient civilizations all the way up through World War I. I taught 6 classes every day, Monday through Friday. I taught at least 150 students. I think one of the early years I saw 180 students a day, every single day. And it was not uncommon for me to break up 2 fights in the hallway outside of my classroom at that time in the school. And this wasn't just going out into the hallway and saying, hey, stop fighting. It was actually going out and physically grabbing onto the belligerents and taking them up to the office. So it's no surprise that the kinds of things that are happening in the hallways are also filtering into the classroom itself. On top of all these things, on top of all these things, I also have bus duty, hall duty, bathroom duty, a number of kind of seemingly trivial things like dress professionally, which is kind of an interesting word, use of the word professional. I had to submit lesson plans according to some kind of format. I had to enforce school rules, which were often changing. I had to grade student work with conventional rubric. I had to submit special education reports and any other kind of psychological evaluation. Sometimes we would get these large forms, we'd have to fill them out, and it could take half hour or 45 minutes. And at any given moment, I could get another email saying, hey, can you do this? That could be sent specifically to me or school-wide to all of my colleagues with some kind of additional responsibility or thing that we had to do. And perhaps most saliently for the purpose of my presentations, I had to submit myself to professional evaluation by administrators. The number of times we had to do this varied, and what had to be done varied throughout my teaching career, but it certainly got more involved in recent years. So again, my goals as a novice teacher were to be helpful to my students in attaining the success they are seeking and to become more capable of providing a rigorous, valuable experience for my students becoming authority in my subject area. As a first-year teacher with all of these responsibilities, it was very, very difficult to do this second goal. And I thought at that time that if I could do that second goal, then I would also accomplish the first goal. But I would go home at night, I would work for several hours, stay up till midnight, sleep a few hours, get up the next day and go back at it. And my goal really became survival, to try to get by. I felt like I was doing a horrible job, but that if I kept at it, maybe next year would get a little bit easier and I would be a little bit better at what I was doing. But I was seeking as much help from colleagues and administrators as I could. And at some point, administrators approached me and several other teachers and asked if we would be willing to attend this conference where they're presenting these learning-focused school strategies. So I went, and here's this learning-focused strategies, which were research-based pedagogical ideology, where they organize curricular material based on what is essential. Lessons are organized around a predetermined essential question that students had to answer at the end of each lesson. So you'd have this essential question, and you go about your lesson, you can evaluate whether the lesson was good or not based on whether or not the students could answer that question. So for example, in an English class, you might have an essential question like, what do good readers do when they don't comprehend the text? Each of the lessons is similarly organized into a unit, and the unit has a unit essential question that once all the students go through all the lessons, then they'll be able to answer the unit essential question. So that's kind of a more general question, like, for instance, in what ways can reading strategy improve our ability to learn? The teaching methods themselves, beyond just the curriculum organization, the teaching methods were set up such that you had specific techniques that were used in a learning focused strategies classroom. 2 things that had to be in place, according to our school district, was an activating strategy and distributed summarization. So an activating strategy was some kind of activity that you do at the beginning of the lesson that would get students oriented towards what was going on in the lesson or provoke them, and then off you go with the lesson. In itself, not necessarily a bad idea, but as I'll explain later, it's not necessarily always a good idea either. Distributed summarization, this is kind of where you interrupt the lesson, you kind of summarize what's happening, and then you move on with the rest of the lesson, you kind of summarize things as you go. So it's kind of a progressive thing towards the ultimate goal of being able to answer these various essential questions. So for example, student activity could be like think, pair, share, where students might answer a question like, how did Hitler rise to power prior to World War II? and they would have to think about an answer, pair up with someone else, and share those responses, and that kind of acted as a summarization. Then once that's done, off you go with the rest of the lesson. Again, not necessarily a bad teaching strategy, but also not necessarily good all the time. And there's several other kind of strategies that get lumped into this learning focus toolkit. That again, administrators tended to have more command of what those things were than the teachers. So there's several things that were appealing about this to me as a novice teacher. One thing was I got to determine what was essential. I got to determine what kind of strategies were going to be used in my classroom. And I got to determine how students would be evaluated, and everything communicated in an organized and clear way that would make sense to the students. And I was going to have ownership and control of my classes. And I thought that by doing this, this would help me attain this second goal I had, which was becoming more capable of providing a rigorous, valuable experience for my students by becoming an authority in my subject area. Learning focused schools provided a pathway towards that goal. So I thought, okay. So all of these things, I thought, okay, this puts me in command and control and possession of my curriculum. But what I quickly realized that as soon as I wrote this curriculum and handed it off to my administrators, I no longer had control. Learning focus and practice meant that administrators approved and possessed the curriculums. The administrators also interpreted what I wrote and told me what it meant. For instance, I was having a discussion in my classroom where students were discussing whether or not Civil War Confederate monuments should be kept in place or removed, which is a controversial topic in the United States. There was a rich discussion where students were interrupting each other and critically evaluating what they were talking about and pushing each other into thinking more deeply about it. On its face, I think most people would look at it and say, this is a good lesson. However, the administrator who came in said, when the curriculum says class discussion, that means you will use one of the LFS discussion techniques. And so regardless of what was happening in the classroom, my administrator prioritized my compliance with the a priori curriculum and also this learning focus ideology over any discretionary decisions I was making, and also critically being responsible for some kind of evaluation of whether or not what was happening was good or not. So I quickly realized that this first goal of being helpful to my students in attaining the success they are seeking could not be really accomplished through this learning focused strategies. This learning focused strategy was some kind of general machinery where my students were unique individuals. And it was that uniqueness that as a professional, with my discretion, is what I needed to address to attain this first goal. Learning focused schools was enforced in a variety of ways. Administrators would appear briefly and unannounced in our classrooms in what was called walkthrough observations. And in these observations, they looked around the room and then they buried their faces in their iPads to go through a series of checklist items. Was the unit essential question posted? Was the lesson essential question posted? Are the students aware of the lesson essential question? Are learning focused strategies being used to produce higher order thinking? Whatever higher order thinking was, that remained an abstract concept, but the administrators could identify what learning focused strategies were. And if you were doing them, then they would say higher order thinking is happening. If you weren't, then they would not say that higher order thinking was happening. It was very much based on the things they could observe, which is the learning focus strategies and define, not this abstract idea. That remained abstract, and it remained really in the discretionary space of the administrator, what they wanted to call higher order thinking. All of this produced a depressing email that was sent to the teacher and then off to the central office. And the central office, I guess, compiled this kind of information, or maybe they read the individual emails. That's kind of left in this kind of secret panopticon kind of space. But I say this is a depressing email because it served as a constant reminder as to here's what learning focused schools are, and here's what you're doing. And the difference between these two things is your deficit. And so I very quickly realized that for the sake of my students who don't need a depressed email or a depressed teacher, I will stop reading these emails. And fortunately, my administrators didn't seem to notice, or maybe they didn't care, as they were kind of going through their thing with their iPads and collecting their technical information. And I, to a great extent, could disregard this. At some point, the tech department was updating the hardware in the school, and the administrators got new laptops. They're always the first ones to get the latest, greatest technology, more so than the teachers. But when they did, they lost the software on which our curriculums are written and could be open. Now, somehow they still had the vast majority of the software for the school, but what I realized at some point is they no longer had the software, they no longer had the curriculum for my class. They had asked for it, and I sent it to them, and they said, oh, we can't open this. Do you have it in another format? And, you know, things get busy. I never got back to them. And I knew now I have the curriculum. I'm the only one that can open it. And I can also change it. And so what I did is I created the project. Now, I can't escape learning focus completely. I wrote this as a learning focused unit, but I designed it in such a way that it opened up so much more discretionary space, because quite simply, it was a project where students had to identify a topic they're interested in. And their interest can change, and that change may cause me to move along with them. So I could act not perfectly, but more as a fiduciary agent. They have to research that topic, develop a thesis, basically have something to say about it and back it up. So this really opened things up for me. Trying to escape learning focus, though, still remains difficult. The one big thing is the formal observation. In later years, this was something that was done twice a year. This is where a high school administrator would observe a lesson in my classroom, and they would evaluate me based on a lesson plan submitted by me in advance, which of course has to be done in this kind of learning focused format, the observed lesson, and the post-lesson reflection submitted by me. By far, the worst part of this, in my view, was these post-observation reflections. They were pure drudgery for me, because they were basically questions asking me, how did you conform to learning focus? Please tell us so that we can evaluate you based on your obedience and conformity to this ideology. If we take a look at the second question, what evidence do you have that your activating strategy was successful? Well, this assumes I'm doing an activating strategy, and that I even think that they're good to do. That's not even a question that I'm allowed or permitted to answer in this format. It's really trying to box me in. So what I had done in the past is, on the day I was getting observed, I would do some kind of activating strategy. And my students, who would usually come into the classroom and say, okay, we're going to go do something. And often I thought the value of it is, can I see that the students are valuing what I'm doing, regardless if there's an activating strategy or not? And maybe the students being actively engaged is evidence that what we're doing is valuable. But again, the activating strategy is a separate and distinct thing that has to be done according to learning focused schools. So on these days I get observed, I would do an activating strategy. So my students would come in and they would wonder, what is this? But they were nice and they did it. And in my view, it was kind of clunky. And then we go on with the rest of our lesson, which is really the meat of what we wanted to be talking about, which might be the research or some other kind of topic of interest or something like that. Okay. When I would do these post-observation reflections, at that point, I could say, well, here's my activating strategy, and here's why it was successful. And the administrator could say, good, you did your activating strategy. Nice, it was successful. And we could kind of create this illusion, this narrative that all of this is well and good. And the problem with that is that it's a violation of this last component of professionalism, engaging in honest dialogue about the practice with the professional community. It really encouraged me to lie. It also encouraged the administrator to lie, but that's less of my concern. It encouraged me to lie, included all my colleagues, to go and write the things that are just going to be the crap that makes your evaluation sound nice and good, rather than really an honest and critical evaluation of the lesson. So the class that I was getting observed at one year, I decided I was really reaching the end of my frustration with this, and I felt I needed to protest against it. And so I decided to use an observation to do that. The class that was getting observed was a sociology class, and it was comprised of 16 to 18-year-olds, high school juniors and seniors. They're mostly white, with a noticeable exception of a few minorities. And these students are Janae, who's a very bright, intelligent, articulate, and confident Black female. And then there's Mark, who's white and often expresses racist and homophobic views. I think he takes joy in being offensive. He would often say things like, I fucking hate trannies, in reference to transgender people. The lesson itself was the project that I described earlier, and it was kind of a midpoint in that project where they're discussing their incomplete research. So they research and work in small groups, but then this midpoint, we assemble the class in a circle and they can engage in some critical dialogue about their ideas and get a lot of feedback. The student that's presenting, Kenyatta, she's a special ed student, so she has a learning disability. But she is articulating her ideas, and her classmates are viewing her as a legitimate voice, and they're engaging with her as a legitimate voice and her ideas. So it goes like this. Orchids in Sea World are like prisoners. They act up because they're kept in these small spaces and then have trouble in the wild when they get out. But humans are fundamentally different than animals. I'm not sure you can simply make that assumption with more support, and even then, I'm not sure if the parallel is really that useful. Trevor responds, yeah, but I don't know. It's sort of like being dropped in the middle of Saudi Arabia. It doesn't matter if you're a human or an animal. You still got to figure it out. And it was like nothing you've been exposed to then. And the dialogue continues as they explore and pull apart Kenyatta's idea. At the end of the class, the assistant principal came up to me and he said, everything looked all right. So again, the standard is the best, and the best you can be is standard. So everything is all right. This is compliment of all the critical dialogue that was happening in his classroom. But he needs to assert his authority as administrator and find some kind of critique. So he says, but you might want to sit next to Mark. He says some things that might be interpreted as racist. Again, reaching the point of really kind of disgust with this whole practice of authority, I express some resistance. And I look at him and I say, he is racist. As long as I have known Mark and known of anyone else to know him, he has said racist things. I do not know of anyone in this room not to have that understanding of Mark. The assistant principal pushes back, again, asserting his authority, but with no real substance. He says, I'm just saying, you might want to sit next to Mark. I would have loved to have escalated it at this point, but other students are coming into the classroom and it wasn't the right time or place to do it. So again, I'm faced with these post-observation reflection questions. But I really can't, as a professional who wants to assert my professionalism, I really can't just submit to responding to these questions. So I reject them. And where normally a single paragraph would have sufficed, I decided to take this first question and respond with 8 single-spaced pages describing the problems with this question and also take on a more engaged critique of this learning-focused strategies. So I talked about how the students' intellectual struggle to conceptualize their research and how it developed to this point. I talked about how a tolerant classroom must tolerate some intolerance, including Mark's racism. Described how my students appreciated Mark as a challenge for them, and they were really provoked by him, and they responded to him. And I talked about how Karl Popper's philosophy of an open society guided my judgment on when and how to act on their needs. I gave nuanced examples of how the members of this class are navigating the complexities of racism through their interactions with each other. And most significantly, I challenged a learning-focused singular view that the value of education is in its instrumentality towards predefined goals. It took a while for the administrators to process what I gave. And I say administrators because normally just the assistant principal who observed me would deal with this, but he sent it off to the central office because he wanted some feedback and maybe some help understanding what I wrote. And I very intentionally did not write things in a very complex way. I provided a lot of support for what I was describing and provided links to TED Talks. It was a lot of material though. So it took some time to get to the post-observation conference. And what the post-observation conference is it's where the administrator, after looking at the lesson, observing the lesson, and reading what I wrote, is now going to provide their final evaluation of me. And I don't know if you're familiar with Milgram's experiments for obedience to authority, but Stanley Milgram in the 1960s did experiments where you have an authority telling the subject of the experiment to administer shocks to another person that are harmful and even perceived as deadly at some point. And though the person who's getting shocked is actually an actor, they're not actually getting shocked. But the subject is now put in this position where they're caught between this moral dilemma of not harming a person and also the moral dilemma of obeying authority. And more often than not, this subject defers to the authority and continues to administer shocks to a person to the point where they think they may have actually killed them. Milgram provides these videos, and you can see the subject in this experiment is squirming in their seat. They don't want to administer the shocks, but they still do it anyway. And to a great extent, this assistant principal was like that subject. He was very uncomfortable. He was shifting around in his seat. He started in the fall. You wrote it up perfectly. I read this one, and I was like, Bryan, what are you doing here? I responded, well, the difference is that in the fall, I wrote it up exactly what I think I was supposed to. Now I'm sharing what I really think. Here I am a professional. And if you're asking me as a respected professional, this is what my honest thoughts are. This is my professional voice. He continued, I know you really care about our students. I have no doubt about that at all. I don't want this, his low evaluation, which he had yet to give me, to be interpreted as me not appreciating you and you not being valued. I agree, you're a good teacher. These kinds of things you bring to the classroom is like at a really high level. You've taught at college before, right? I mean, I'm glad you're here, but why aren't you teaching at the college level? Have you considered it? I responded, so I'm an outlier. I think about teaching in a different way. What kind of place is there for someone like me who does that? That's a good question. He continued, I got to know you're on board with Learning Focus, right? I mean, I don't think I'm waving the banner of it too much here, but I got to know you're on board, right? I said, your question isn't separately connected to the fact that I'm sitting here in your office and you were evaluating me. I do not think I'm completely free to share my thoughts. He responded, I won't ask you to answer that. So he looked down and away. In his summative evaluation, he chose not to focus on the dialogue that was happening in the classroom. He chose not to focus how a special ed student whose voice is sometimes ended up suppressed or quieted in the classroom is elevated into an egalitarian place with my fellow students. And they're engaging with her in legitimate dialogue, how they're pushing each other to really look into depth at issues that students are bringing up as important. And to a great extent, they're guiding it, making it happen as opposed to me. Instead of all those positive things that were happening in the classroom, the assistant principal felt he had to create a different narrative because of what I wrote after the observed lesson. He wrote down, Mark shared Mexicans coming into the US, off topic and insensitive in response to Trevor's ideas about dropping someone into a new culture. Pre and post conference reflections as addressed in your last year's observation, where I protested much less, but nonetheless protested. These questions are designed to document your planned implementation of our district delivery system of instruction, learning focused strategies. These questions should be answered as presented and supported with evidence. Final rating, marginal. Marginal is a very low evaluation for an experienced teacher. It's one that should normally raise red flags in the central office, though I never heard anything from them. So this, I think, illustrates how institutionalism deprofessionalized teachers. And the technical narrative of what good teaching is was taken control of and commanded by the administrators. And that pushed the discretionary space of me out of the way in favor of this technical knowledge and this technical narrative. And when I tried to resist against it and advocate for my own professionalism, then I was punished as such. The fiduciary agency is removed with these technical practices. My expertise in the field, it doesn't matter. It's pushed away in favor of administrators maintaining their authority. This is an intrusion in discretionary space, so that my discretionary decisions are no longer trusted. And it also encouraged dishonesty in our dialogue about what's happening, because it's more about how well we're complying with these learning focused strategies rather than the reality of what's happening in the classroom and whether it's good or not. So it was the worst evaluation of my career, but despite that, I emerged with my professionalism intact. Thanks. All right. There we are. So what do you think?
Can I ask a question, Bryan?
Please.
First? Where was your professional group in this? In other words, did you have a professional learning community? Were there other teachers in your discipline?
Mm-hmm. So there's not a very strong or clear professional group. I have other people in my department, colleagues, which I will talk to. So I do have my fellow teachers. There's no formal organization to that. And they're also kind of subject to this same kind of hierarchical control, and they're trying to survive on their own. Okay, so there's that. There's also the teachers union, but the union itself acts much more as a labor union as opposed to a professional organization. So as a labor union, they're interested in looking, okay, is there a violation of the contract and these very objective things such as are teachers being asked to work longer hours than what they can do, or are administrators following the procedures they're supposed to in their kind of oppression of teachers and all the procedures that they're putting on teachers. So it becomes also its own kind of technical practice as opposed to one that's operating with its own kind of professional discretion. So the teachers union is not a very good professional organization at my school and many other schools too.
Yeah.
It may exist as a good professional organization somewhere, but I'm not sure where that is.
So when you describe writing your lessons and having to use the learning focused structure, did you guys write joint lessons, or was it everybody an individual?
Sometimes teachers would write joint lessons, and these would become kind of more standardized, which in my view becomes its own kind of professional problem, because standardization is also removing the discretion of the professional. Because now, again, you're complying with the standard as opposed to what's emerging in the realities of your fiduciary beneficiaries. So some of that was happening, and administrators liked when that happened. They, in particular, which I ran into an instance where administrators were asking me, well, aren't there, common assessments like standard quizzes? Fortunately, there were not, but there was standardized final exams at one point. We've since eliminated them. And actually, to be clear, as we go on here, I have really wonderful administrators in my building now. Okay, and that's a recent development in the last couple of years. What I'm talking about here is what I've been subject to for most of my career, which in my view is bad administration. So there is some standardization of practice between teachers. And I can guess why you asked that question, but I'm wondering why did you ask that?
Well, because to me, professionalism also means community. Like, it seems like you're stronger in community. And so I guess I'm not necessarily thinking of like a joint lesson where you do exactly the same thing, but I'm thinking about a lesson that you have a discussion about, like maybe it's the same topic and you're talking about how it went in your class and someone else is talking about how it went in that class. And then between you have, I don't know, a professional conversation. So did any of that happen, or were you all by yourself? I was trying to get a picture of whether you were completely isolated in thinking about these curricular ideas, or if you had some, I don't know, community.
Yeah, so I think both things are actually happening because we're so busy. We're teaching so many classes. We go from class to class to class to class to meeting to class to whatever. We're often isolated. We're alone in our classroom with our students, and the administrators are going to be the ones who come in. Other teachers don't have the time to do that. They're not available to drop into each other's classes. So in many ways, we're isolated. Just the structure of the institution is that. And in the institutional design, that seems fine because the administrator is the authority. Why have other teachers go in and serve and whatever, right? So there's that. But I'd also say, in spite of that, teachers are smart people and they are talking to each other. They are supportive of each other. So there is a lot of dialogue about what's right and good for our students. We're constantly faced with the realities of our students and trying to help them and do what's right in spite of these institutional demands. So we do talk to each other about how we're navigating it. We also share some of the same students. So there's a lot of conversation that happens there. I'm saying that's happening in spite of the institution.
Mm-hmm.
So that is happening, and it's weak in terms of I'd say it's strong in terms of the humanity. As people we're working, and in spite of the system, we are being professional and supporting students. But it's weak in terms of trying to push for professional change. It's not necessarily valued. Mm-hmm. Or it tries to become objectified, like, oh, great, you had a meeting, you complied. Okay, let's standardize that and make it, a practice of some kind that's now institutionalized. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
I want to continue, if I mind, this question that Diana asked. And in my kind of terminology, what you're asking, Diana, is what can be called, what's community behind. Mm-hmm. This is a little bit different. It's not exactly the same, Diana, like you're asking about professional community, and I'm thinking community behind. And it's very interesting, but I think your assistant principal has a suspicion what it's coming from. And he thinks it's coming from university. Your community behind is university. That's why he thinks about, he asks, oh, you're teaching, I've heard you're teaching on the university level, college level. And I think this is, from his point of view, his suspicion, maybe I'm misreading him. I think he makes several points with that. Maybe, one point is you don't belong here, and you should go to the university. But also another point, which is, I think, very interesting point, that it's coming from university. Your rebellion's coming from university. Mm-hmm. And I want to hear what you think about that. Is kind of whether or not he's right in that suspicion or not. In other ways, let me ask more provocative. If you didn't go to the graduate school, would this event happen or not? I know it's a kind of hypothetical kind of scenario, and history already happened, and it's difficult to say what would happen in parallel life if you didn't go to the university. And but anyway, I want to hear your
okay. Yeah, help me remember the second question, because I want to address the first question first. I think your suspicion is right. I think that
no, it's not my suspicion. I think it's assistant principal suspicion.
Right. I think I think your suspicion of my assistant principal suspicion is correct. So I think that's part of what he's thinking, or maybe more importantly, feeling. He almost has an authority identity issue. He's an assistant principal. He's a low-level administrator. He wants to be promoted, so he wants to appeal to higher level administrators. So he has to present himself as an authority. And I exist as a threat to that authority. And in particular, this perceived community has some muscle behind it. And I can articulate my ideas. And I will. And so his weak control of theory, which is usually his strength, is now running into a reality that's not yielding on one hand, but the person who's communicating that reality is unwilling to yield. Certainly earlier in my career, and maybe had I not had this community behind, I would have been in a position where I felt I'd have to yield to his version of reality, the theory, a little bit more, just for my own survival. Because after that evaluation, I've got to go back to the important work that I do, and I don't need obstacles. So these evaluations are very threatening to me, is that they can create problems for me. Administrators who view me as a threat can make my life difficult. Mm-hmm. And it's not just about having a difficult life, it's about being able to do my job and support my students and faces real moral dilemmas in my classroom of how to help them. So I guess I'm kind of getting into your second question too, Eugene, and that is, would I do this? That's a good question. I don't know. I don't think I would do it as well. I think I would still do it because I feel morally compelled to do it. I felt that before I went to graduate school, and to a great extent, this is one of the motivations to go to grad school, because I was really disturbed by these things and I wanted to understand them better. I couldn't articulate them well, and that's why I would say I wouldn't necessarily have been able to do it as well. And because I wasn't able to do it as well, I'd be less bold in doing it. I'd do it less often. All of those things. Yeah.
That's why I asked about community, because your discussion about threat.
Yeah, right. So in this case, the university community became very important to me. And as a member of the teaching community there, I do as much as I can to share my experiences. And that includes, like, there's a democratic school not far from our high school that I know because of working with Eugene, University of Delaware. And so I've been able to organize visits to that school just to serve as a provocation. I don't want to become the new authority, but I want to invite my colleagues into this professional dialogue and see things that I've seen, and that they can make sense of them the way that they have, and contribute to the conversation. So, but it's difficult. I was just talking to a colleague yesterday who since retired expressed appreciation that I would go around to different rooms and visit during my planning period. So like what you're saying about teachers getting into the rooms, that was rare. And it took a lot of effort for me to do that simply because I didn't have the time to. But I saw it as being very important. But it's difficult to do. And as a result, I think, yeah, teachers are often isolated, and that interferes with that sense of community.
Yeah, I have seen things change into what you're describing over time. I graduated in 1985, and the feeling, it was kind of the end of the 70s, and the feeling of open classroom, and really you had much more autonomy to teach in the ways that you felt you needed to teach. You had fewer resources. So we were wishing for these resources that you have too much of. But then I saw it change. There was a political movement to try and control what was happening in schools and classrooms and kids. But one other reason I asked about community, I had a financial secretary actually protect me that I didn't realize till years later, because my classroom, I was teaching science at the time, was very loud. And the principal had to control that because there were certain classroom management techniques you were supposed to use and have. And she said, "You leave her alone." She said, "I walk down the hall to learn things. There are things going on in that classroom that are interesting to me." And so unbeknownst to me, there was somebody in my corner that I didn't even realize at that time was in my corner. So I think all those things are important.
Yeah, and you're reminding me of some things too. Similar to that, there was a hall monitor who, she was my favorite hall monitor in my career there, because she was so interactive with the kids, and her job's kind of hall security, right? But she was a kind person. She was like that tough mother kind of person. And despite of her policing role, she was deeply a caring person, which is kind of a difficult role to straddle, but she managed that, I think, better than most people could. But she would sometimes come into my classroom and she would talk about how much she enjoyed that when she did. Like if she had to come in to pick up a kid or drop someone off, she'd stay for a little bit. So it was people like her, and then other administrators who had some of their own children go through my classroom over the years. All of these things build up professional capital for me. I was a well-regarded teacher. And so I went into these protests that I did of sorts with that professional capital. it would be difficult for them to, I talked about getting a marginal rating. It would be very difficult for them to give me an unsatisfactory rating. Okay, that you get 2 of those and you can be dismissed. Okay, so that's a very, very serious step. And when you get 1 of those, there's certain steps and procedures that are put into place. I would be a very difficult person to put that label on. The union would get involved, and it would have to go up the hierarchy. And even this marginal evaluation, I could have pushed to the school board and protested it. I didn't. Part of me would have liked to have lived that reality and just explored that. But even though this particular administrator, I didn't necessarily like him. There was things other administrators were doing that I didn't like. There's a lot of demands in the school district, and I think that they had a job to hold things together. And at that point, I didn't want to disrupt that. It wasn't the most important thing in the district, despite how important it was for me. So I didn't pursue that.
I think schools very much are places of authority and control. And I think they're scared that something's going to happen with kids, like if they lose that really kind of prison-like control. And to me, that's more what I read when he talked about university. You were behaving like a university. I think they're trying to get kids ready to behave the way they think they should behave. And then the university, they're seen as releasing them, and then they can behave in other ways. They're supposedly, they've developed this moral core of behavior, and they can release them onto the universities. And so it is so detrimental to learning.
I agree. And I think the opposite ends up becoming true, right? You have students who are subordinated to order and obedience that they don't even know their own desires. And then suddenly they're released to a place where they can completely explore them without any practice having done so before, or knowledge of even what they are. This project I do, I think, was pretty revealing of that, because students can pick something they're interested in, and they'll say, I don't know what I'm interested in. And I say, okay. And I'm not quick to rescue them. They definitely catch my attention when they say that. And I want to provide what kinds of supports they may need. But part of that, I think the bottom needs to fall out a little bit for them to say, okay, now I'm left to figure this out.
Yeah, we experience that in the math world too, when we're trying to really promote discussion of ideas and exploration, and they'll actually get mad that you're doing such things. And the kids get mad, and lots of times involve the parents. Like, why aren't you doing that? I do, we do, you do kind of picking model of teaching mathematics. And so they'll try to use the whole system because it's not what they've grown up with.
Right. Yeah, that creates an interesting dilemma for me. In the subjects I teach, I'm sure I get much less of that. But it still creates an interesting dilemma, because the student is saying, well, here's what I want, right? I want you to tell me what to do. So as a professional and as their fiduciary, do I do that? And particularly if I'm looking at it like, oh, this is you're a product of this system, it creates a dilemma.
Yeah, right? It's not black and white.
Yeah.
I don't think anything in learning is black and white. But
as you know, Bryan, I discussed that dilemma in my paper, which is exciting. And I think part of that, it's it is interesting dilemma, a very complex one, but part of that could happen because the students don't what I call colonized by institutions, by some kind of ideas can be ideas, and doing the decolonization can be helpful, and helpful with the students, of course, themselves assess how helpful it is or not. But it, I had a very good example of that when most of my students find it extremely helpful, the kind of decolonization. For Diana, you and Amy, because I think Brian knows that case. My students, in my classes, that students has choices of what they want to study, but that choices is not only that I created. In one of the classes on cultural diversity, I think majority now of the topics coming from the students now. So one of these topics is about bullying, and basically it took me a while to realize that what they want me is how to suppress bullies in the classroom. And so it's kind of how I reinterpreted how to bully a bully. And this is what they want. And basically the best way to do that, it's using reward. It's like behaviorism, how to use rewards and punishment. And they really appreciate that, by the way, because it gives them confidence, whatever. But at some point I realized that maybe I'm doing, this is like, what's my fiduciary duty about that? Do I need to do exactly what they ask me, or I suspect again there's colonization, and maybe to test this idea? So I developed interesting survey for them consisting of just one question, and the one question was, in my future classroom, I want my students to say, I don't want to bully other people because. And I provide a list of possible things because I'm afraid I will be punished, for example, or I want to get reward for that, or I don't want to be in trouble with my parents, or it become because I think bullying is bad, or I don't want to be like that, and so forth. So there is kind of behaviorist answers with moral answers, and I provided that. And the students get very interesting things about that, answering that. The high majority answering morally, and there's some students, the answers were not mutually exclusive. They can match it. But some students choose behavioral answers, and it created wonderful discussions about that, why some students choose behaviorist answer because they afraid themselves of the administration, parents, legal issues, and so forth. But some choose also moral issues that behaviorist answer, like I cannot tolerate bullying, period. I want to suppress it as much as possible. It doesn't matter how. And it created such a deep discussions among the students, and they start thinking like, wow, how come I wanted the suppression of this bullying? How I want to be basically bigger bully for them? And is it a kind of morally wrong, or what it leads to? So, and then they actually were thankful to me for bringing this survey, because it challenges many of their assumptions and desires. So in a way, I think that can be a very interesting approach with addressing this issue about what's fiduciary is, because fiduciary is not exactly. It's helping students to figure out like what's good for them. It's not doing it for them, but on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily mean that they know what's good for them. By the way, it's true from any fiduciary relations, including like medical or financial. The problem is that one of the big problems is not like provides advice how to realize your desire, but part of that is actually to figure out like what's my desire, and is it good for me, that desire, or not? And that's part of the fiduciary duty, in my view.
Right, and sometimes there's very explicit boundaries in that too. Like a medical professional may say, I see you want that, but I will not prescribe that medication to you. Yeah.
And that's another part when it's the boundary of fiduciary, like when you stop being fiduciary, when you say, no, in my view, I cannot be fiduciary for you. for different reasons. It could be because I'm incompetent for certain things, or because I think it's a morally or professionally wrong.
Right.
Yeah. By the way, I had that situation with the student back in Soviet Union who actually was a kind of criminal already, and he was like engineering criminal. And I was teaching physics, and at some point he wants me to teach how to develop a better, like a key that opens any door or something like that, which is an interesting physical problem, or how to make a good knife that could fly well, which is again excellent physical problem how to solve that, but you can see that what it leads to. And I refuse to provide that. This kind of, I refuse to be his fiduciary as a teacher, as a physics teacher.
Right. Yeah. And I think that some of those decisions, like even that decision not to come to the rescue of my students when they don't know what they want to do is sort of in that space. They're expressing a desire that I'm not satisfying for them. Right?
Just one comment. In my view, this makes teaching up, because there is no kind of in advance you don't know about that, and even it's really, you can be doing right things, you can be doing wrong things, you can figure out later or maybe never figure out that. That's what it makes, in my view, up. And I think Amy wants to say something.
I agree with you, Eugene, that there are so many decisions that you make that it can't be scripted and it can't be, laid out ahead of time. It has to be done with all of the variables that are in front of you at the moment. It is really an art form.
Yeah.
Bryan, what I wanted to hit on was there's just three things that really resonated with me. And one was your experience in your first year teaching, how they gave you so many, you had your sociology, AP history, US history, like your course load and all the expectations. And we're in the situation right now with a teacher shortage, teacher crisis. A lot of people are leaving the field. And I think just bringing up some of those things that are very real for us might shed some light on the why people are leaving and why we're in this situation. So I had a similar experience my first year teaching. I had 36 first graders in my class, and just being, and inner city, a lot of the kids just needed more attention than I was able to give them, and I just felt like a complete failure. And I think a lot of times the school system sets you up to feel like a failure and that it's your fault, not the system's fault. And I think it took me a long time to figure out that, hey, wait, like I was not set up to be successful, until I had like a year that I had 12 kids. And then I was like, oh, this is what good teaching feels like.
Right, yeah. Yeah. And also those years of experience where you can, if you got 36 kids, you would do so much better now than you could in the past, right?
But we were just trying to figure it out. It's so hard. So that was my first one. My second one was, my first year teaching was 1995. And my teacher evaluation was 1 page, and it was on, carbon paper where my principal came in and wrote 1 page of like comments, good job, Amy, satisfactory, unsatisfactory kind of thing. Like, here's a few comments, a few pointers, right? I just went back to teaching 5 years ago. And so, the difference between 1995 and 2018 was a booklet. My observation was a booklet. My observer came in and she typed the whole time I was teaching. It was like an hour observation. And I mean, I got this packet that was this thick of things that I said, things the kids said, all the boxes she had to check off. I felt bad for her, because this was the expectation for her as my observer, to check all these boxes and write up this report. I thought, she has to do this for me and all my colleagues. I just thought, it was a tremendous waste of time.
Oh, I agree. And so my question for you is, if you look at that report that was produced, what was the value of that?
Just, I mean, I looked to the last page. Was it satisfactory or not? Okay. What was my rating, and like the conversation that came through it, part of it was good because it you do reflect on your stuff, but a lot of it was like, did you conform to what they want you to be doing? So that resonated with me too, just having that. And I feel like when somebody does come to observe you, it's an invasion, I think, of the community that you set up with your class. The kids, I think, feel it. I certainly feel it. I'm not the same teacher as I am in that moment that I would be if there was not a stranger in the room. I had like first graders cry when the observer came. I'm like, this kid never cries. And the
Yeah.
never seen, what did you do to this child? I'm like, I didn't do anything to the child. Oh, no.
Yeah. 'Cause they're right. They're not a participant in the community,
Right.
not
Yeah.
operating in that community. They're not doing the same job you or the students are doing.
Yeah. So that
Yeah.
certainly sets up an artificial situation. And the third thing I just wanted to comment was, let me think if I can remember it. The outlier. So I also taught at the university before going back. I taught at the university. I had kids. I stayed home for 12 years with my children. And then when I went back to my career, it was as a reading specialist. And they didn't know what to do with me because to check the boxes for my reading specialist certification, I had to take these courses, but I was the teacher of record for those courses. So they were saying, well, it's not on your transcript. We can't give you certification. I'm like, but I was the teacher of record at a university. Like, can't you take my box? No, you have to go back and take that class. And I'm like, I am not going back and taking this. I think just the bureaucracy of it, like the lack of common sense in our field. And just my whole point is like, you wonder why we're in a crisis of teachers not wanting to teach, but these, and it's authority, it's control, it's all of the things that you mentioned. So just all of those things really resonated with me, Bryan, and in your experience.
Yeah. And I think, we've had conversations before where I think we felt similarly.
Yeah. And they don't value the experience that you gain in the university in the regular classroom. So like on my teaching salary scale, my 4 years teaching at the university didn't count for 4 years of experience up the scale, like, as a first grade teacher kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's just interesting how those things just don't jibe.
Right. I think the technical decision making, it's done at that level because it makes it easier. Discretion is difficult. And it's ultimately a responsible act to say, I'm deciding this rather than having some kind of system decide it for you. And I think of this with administrators coming into the classroom, and they can say, okay, was the learning focused strategies used? Yes, no. Which ones were observed? These. Was the essential question posted? Yes, no. Right. So the administrator themselves becomes a machine. Their discretion doesn't matter, and responsibility for the whole act evaporates. It's a matter of, are the gears sharp or not? And it doesn't matter what those gears are doing because it's already been predetermined that this is what we're doing. On some level, if we decide, okay, we need to change the standardized testing or things like that, those things are done at some kind of higher level. But again, that discretionary space for the actual interaction with the student is not trusted to the teacher.
Right.
Therefore, institutionalism kind of creeps in to eliminate it. Yeah.
I guess
I can't hear you.
So Eugene and I have had these conversations regarding pre-service because I have lamented that I'm getting the students ready for something they can't do because the system is designed not to support teaching in certain ways. In math, there's such a focus on testing them. So we have all these standardized tests. If you felt pressure, math and English really feel pressure because they're the ones really being tested heavily. And so pacing guides are a big deal. So you have to be at a certain place at a certain time. And we're trying to teach them to teach in other ways, to listen to the student conversation, to facilitate conversations and discussion, to unpack big ideas rather than just procedural fluency. And the problem I see is we send them out into a world where they can't do that.
Yes. Let me ask this question. I'd have my own answers, of course, but how do you know that that's the best thing to do?
Well, how do you know what's the best thing to do?
These other techniques, other than the
You mean discussion?
Yeah.
Well, there is some research out there regarding learning and discussion. I also was in the classroom for 20 years, and I don't know how to unpack and understand mathematics without discussion of the ideas in a group.
Yeah, I'm not a math teacher, but I can imagine this. That I have a student in front of me who doesn't understand something. And in order for me to help them, I need to understand them.
Yeah.
How are they conceptualizing things? And what sense are they making of things? And how can I make sense of them? So I think whether it's mathematics or English or other humanities, visual arts even, there's meaning being communicated and shared, right?
Right. So it's been my experience that no matter how wonderfully I present a lesson or teach something, if I'm the one doing all the talking and they're just doing all the sitting and listening, no matter how wonderful connections I've made, it doesn't matter. It doesn't result in learning for them whatsoever. And is there never a time when you can just listen to somebody and say, aha? Yeah, but you have to be able to say that aha. It has to resonate with you in some way. So can someone argue with me that, yes, I can learn from lecture? Perhaps, but my argument back is that if you're learning from lecture, it's making some connection to something you've already processed or developed or has had some experience with.
Yeah, and I find that sometimes students want to hear something and I can explain it, which the explanation becomes like a mini lecture of sorts. But then there's their reaction to it, and so often I'm provoked by the students' different interpretation of things than mine.
Yes,
and I think that's a very important part of education. It's not about getting them to master my kind of thinking. It's about their thinking.
Yeah. And I also think teaching and learning is cyclical. So there have been so many times in my career when I thought I fully understood some big idea or a big mathematical idea, and a student thought about something in a different way, which made me kind of go, wait a minute, and have my own aha moments. And so I really think it's a community experience learning mathematics and even digging in anything that's new or deep or problem solving. I guess because problem solving is at the heart of mathematics, I see it as a community endeavor, and I see it as a cyclical learning process for all involved.
Yeah, and I think these things need to happen in these discretionary spaces, right? If we determine ahead of time, this is what's to be taught and how it's supposed to be taught, and this is the understanding people are supposed to have when they're done, then it destroys these places. And these places aren't happening because I think they're viewed as dangerous. They can't be centrally controlled. Whether
absolutely. I've seen a political movement in my lifetime to really, really get a handle on what's going on in the classroom.
Right. Yeah. It's an effort to do that. And then it's almost like, an effort to understand what's happening in the classroom ends up destroying what's happening in the classroom. I think because they're trying to have these understandings on some kind of macro level, which they can design policy, right? But the education is really happening in these unique, ephemeral events that are happening in specific contexts.
But they can't keep good administrators either. You talked about losing good teachers.
Yeah, we're very fortunate to have the administrators we have right now, just because I've never had administrators as good in my life. But also the other side of it is, who is out there? And I think since we have very good administrators, they've been able to find very good people, and they're not hiring in our school. Our good administrators right now aren't hiring teachers based on a lot of like these technical things, like looking at a resume, like they've had this certification, this many years of experience. They seem to be hiring really more on personality, their interest in kids. These kinds of things are prioritized, as opposed to a bunch of technical things to check off the box and saying we have this kind of teacher. So I think as a result, we've been able to get better teacher position. Better teachers are being hired in our school, even despite the teacher shortage. So I mean, certainly that the teacher shortage has not eliminated the challenges with that.
To me, a good administrator, when they hire, does not do it with just administrators, but has a teacher team.
Yes, and they're doing a little bit of that. I wish there was more. In fact, I wish the teachers would hire the teachers, not the administrators.
Yeah.
And so there are some of the institutional structures that are in place that I think it makes it difficult for good administrators to do their jobs well. It's because they're given the responsibility to make sure that this and this is done. So they have to appeal to the hierarchical institution, as opposed to appealing to the teachers who may be acting as fiduciary agents for their students. So I think it's difficult to be anywhere on this hierarchy and try to make those spaces. But I think a good administrator is managing the institution so that professionalism can take place, even if the institution's bad. A good administrator may be trying to change the institution. A good professional may be trying to change the institution. A good professional teacher may be trying to make the institutional work for the benefit of the students in spite of bad administrators. But it's a lot of wasted time and energy and effort to do those kinds of things if we could just change the institution.
I'm curious if you've seen change over time. How long have you been in the classroom?
25 years. I'm on sabbatical now, but this would be my 26th year. Yeah. So I came in right before No Child Left Behind. And I would have to say I described all those fights. It was a bit chaotic in our school, but I had a lot of freedom to teach what I was teaching. And I was teaching unique subjects too, psychology and sociology. I am the only teacher who has taught them since I've been there. So I have a lot of freedom there. Occasionally I've taught an American Studies class that had a standardized final exam. And now we don't have the standardized final exam. So even if I get an American history class, I can have a lot of freedom in terms of how to teach it. The big change I'm seeing is the actual people that are my administrators. With the retirement of my former principal a few years ago, she was my principal for 3 years, but an assistant principal for many years before that. And I think she became my nemesis because I wasn't easily suppressed. I would speak up to her. I would speak up in faculty meetings. And so I think it became her personal goal to either herself or when she became principal, she might select the assistant principal who would give me the hardest time, to go in and after me and not necessarily make my life easy. But even she had this kind of split consciousness with me. I was in her office one time and she asked, how can we make other teachers like you? How can we get them to think critically about whatever? And it was the most bizarre question because it seemed like she did nothing but harass me. And the answer to her question is, stop doing that. Make these spaces where I don't know if other teachers will be like me. Maybe there'll be something else. Maybe there'll be something better for students. But you're the obstacle to this happening. Like her efforts to try to control me, which I think I effectively resisted, is what made my teaching what it was, which her perception was good.
Brian, you might misinterpret her intentions. Maybe her intention was exactly opposite what you think. Is she wants to say how to make others teachers like you and with your answer she would consider and how can I blog that?
Right.
But then she kept to herself because she wants to know like where she has to build the blogs.
Right. Yeah.
More
Certainly,
effectively.
it's certainly not bad advice to be aware of that possibility. And I've seen that kind of manipulation in administrators, but I think in her case it was much more sincere. She's an interesting person herself. I think she suffered from low self-esteem, and I think her ascendancy into administration provided her this kind of objective authority, right? And so she could objectify her status as being something. It was something that could be defined, which was maybe contrary to a lot of her more subjective views of herself. So unfortunately, she wasn't necessarily competent. So this, kind of authority could be threatened, and then her reaction to that would be to weaponize that authority. But she was also a real person who could have empathy at times. So at times I could collaborate with her, but there was real limits to that, and I couldn't trust her because she could surprise me when those limits would pop up. And she would also, go on the attack too.
I have 4 questions for you. I would like interesting to discuss, but maybe we should not throw like 4 of them immediately because I don't want to monopolize time either, so other people can jump as well. But let me read all of them, and maybe to start with one, and other people can do some other things, and then we return back. But yeah, just like as it is now, like the space of my questions that I'm interested. My first question is about types of professionalism, and you basically focus on 2, which I conceptualize. One you conceptualize, and another I conceptualizing. But I want to ask about others as well. So one is technological professionalism, which is you described like conventional idea of professionalism. The second one, which is you nicely articulating, and I call it authorial professionalism, or can be called fiduciary professionalism. It could be either way. I don't know which one you would like, but I think it's nice to have it label, and you described it rather well for me. At least. I don't know for other people, but for me it's rather clear. But the third one is Weber actually proved that, Max Weber, the sociologist, German sociologist, and he called it, or putting together his term and the term professionalism, it's possible to call charismatic professionalism, coming from charisma of the person. Mm-hmm. And we can call it professionalism as well, because there is a call for type of this professionalism in the literature, at least in the last book that we discussed in our book club. Okay. And yeah, I'm suggesting to look at that. But I wonder if there is some other forms of professionalism, and what you think about charismatic professionalism as well.
Okay. Well, let me start with my understanding of that, but I think it's coming from Weber's notion of charismatic authority. Am I right?
Yeah, of charismatic leader. And teacher is a leader. So, yeah. And in this case, it's kind of can be described like that.
Right. And my understanding, which may not be correct, is that charismatic authority is based on some kind of competence, and others perceive that competence in you, and then that competent person emerges as a leader because they can solve things that are.
No, it's not because of that. No. It's much more complex because it's coming from charisma. So you can, because in a way you get authority, but a charismatic authority. It's not necessarily coming from your. It is charismatic expert in a way competence. It's not necessarily competence because you can be dull but extremely knowledgeable person. No, that will not work.
Yes, so it is. It's a certain. Right, it's a certain kind of competence, and I think that at least in my imagination of this kind of
can interrupt. It's like charisma of sucking in your sphere and whatever sphere you are. Oh, by the way, some criticism of these charismatic things, which is in that book, which is very caricaturing of this.
Okay.
It's about like it's becoming like teaching becoming entertainment, pure entertainment. So for the students like that because it's very lovely, it's related to them. Yeah, but the critique of that can be very little substance behind that.
Yeah,
But it's caricature of that. I don't like that because it can happen in my view, but it's extreme caricature of this form of professionals like that.
And here's why I'm viewing that charisma as a form of competence. It's that person can really kind of define what's important, right? And they're competent at that. So you may have someone who really solves a physical problem, like they're an excellent mechanic, but the charismatic authority will define the value of the mechanic for the mechanic, right? And it's viewed that the charismatic authority can do that because that charismatic authority has competence in making those discerning decisions, and other people willingly follow the guidance of that.
I don't think it's about mechanic. No, it's kind of person who is, you come to that, you might not fix the car, but you really like to be there. No, it's not about competence. It's not about doing well something. It's like a good entertainer, part of that. Right. And again, I don't like to go in that path because it's become caricature, but I like that because in a sense it's captured this. It's a strong person. You come in there, it's a strong person. By the way, they like a lot of lecturing, Diana, because you really mesmerized by that lecture. It may be very poor quality information, by the way. It depends. It could be high quality or can be poor quality, but you just mesmerized by you having experience there, real experience. And the question is, what is experience about? That's a question. But you, as a student, let's say, you like to be there. You're looking forward to come there because it's eventful. Something interesting happened. Right. You don't know the quality of that. It can be at times it become very abusive. By the way, Trump is a very good charismatic leader, and he can be a charismatic teacher like that.
Absolutely, yeah, right. And this is
and it's nothing to do with his competence. He might bring you to he might lead you to disaster.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm not saying when I say competence, it's very compartmentalized. It may be competent in terms of entertaining you. It may be competent in terms of drawing from your emotions, giving you an emotional experience, right? But there again, you see Trump is defining what's important, what's not, and is viewed as the competent person to make those decisions and create a narrative. Very similar, you might see Colbert as this charismatic person. But there again, there's this kind of, in my view, competence in defining the narrative and what's important, what's not important, and the value of other people who may be preventing the disaster, right? But this charismatic authority has the competence in commanding that narrative for the entertainment, for the emotions, for the whatever of their audience, right?
Yeah. The big thing is it's competence not necessarily about material, but competence about creating lived experience for the others.
Yes, right. Yeah, but if you really need your car fixed, that wears thin. Right.
Well, exactly. But on the other hand, it may be true, maybe not, because some people can combine. That's why I'm saying I don't like this kind of caricaturing of them, because caricaturing leads away from, because they can be actually good mechanics as well. And it's also true. So you don't know about that. And,
they may not just be superficial, right? That is true too. Yeah. So can we go back to your original question?
Well, I'm just thinking about, it's very interesting to think about not only these two types of the professionalism, but several types of professionalism, and maybe discuss them in kind of, at least in the background, because maybe this charismatic professionalism for the teachers is not super important because, again, they're to some degree suppressed at the school as well, because they're not doing standards and they don't doing this technological, because technological professionalism right now is hegemonic in schools, at least. And actually trying to be hegemonic everywhere, but especially in schools right now. But I think it's maybe useful to think about a discussion about this other type of professionalism besides these two that one we're discussing. Just mention them, maybe not exactly to say you're not getting to them because it's less important for you, but for your discussions.
Right.
But at least to mention that it's not just two that exist.
Right.
And maybe more than three. Maybe, I don't know, Amy and Diana, have you can you think about other type of professionalism besides these three: technological, authorial / fiduciary, and charismatic, especially in the teachers, in the context of the teaching profession, like
Well, so I don't know if I have the vocabulary for this, but we've been studying democratic schools. So what does professionalism look like in those settings?
That's an interesting question. I'm constantly asking this question to some teachers, like Jim Rickmudel, and I couldn't find a good answer. It's not. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just my feeling that they're not well reflected there. Like, what does it like? It was in the context. Ask them. They don't call it teacher. They call it staff. Okay, because they don't think teaching is in the way how it's especially defined is important and essential and so on and so forth. But I ask them how they select people who is staff, like what they're looking for, and it's very difficult for them to articulate that. My feeling is that just they see it, they know, but it's not well reflected. I couldn't find any good reflection on that. I tried to read that. Maybe I'm missing literature, but Diana, I think you're absolutely right. This is one way to look at that. And that literature, try to abstract if anybody reflected that. And maybe this authorial fiduciary, by the way, maybe this is exactly right, but maybe not. That's interesting to think about that. But I agree with you that it's one place to look at. To see. Okay, my next question, if you don't mind, unless Amy or Dan, you want to jump and have another question or another comment. Okay.
No, not me. My brain is still going round. You started something, and now I can't think of anything else.
Well, my second one is something that already you guys discussing that, but I want a little bit more discussion of that. And let me tell, it consists of two kind of sub questions. Because if you answer one sub question, the other one might not make sense at all. It depends, Bryan, how you answer to that.
Okay.
My question is, second one, it's relationship between institution and this authorial / fiduciary professionalism. First of all, my question is, are they compatible? And in this case, yes or no, or maybe. And the second one, if they are compatible, that's why I'm saying it doesn't make any sense if you say no, they're not compatible. If they are compatible, what's your recommendations? Like, in a way, how you can think about different type of institutions that will support this authorial or fiduciary professionalism. And I'm saying that I could hear your discussion with, especially with Diana, already you started discussing that. But I want you to more focused on that. Yeah. And to provide, in a way, what's missing in your presentation is, for me, is recommendations. Like what you would recommend. You're providing a very good framework. You're providing very deep not example case. It's a case, not example, with excellent analysis. But after that, what's missing is recommendations usually at the end. And you start discussing that with Diana. It's not like you don't have it, but I want you to specific. And maybe you can start with the bigger question. Do you think it's compatible? Because institutions are kind of human machines, and this authorial fiduciary professionalism is working against a machine, any machine. On the other hand, we need machines because like somebody needs to have schedules, which is machinery things. And some other things, which is kind of machinery nature. But the question is, what is role, if at all, this machinery for supporting this authorial fiduciary professionalism, and not stay on the way of that? Because it is what it is now, which Diana described, which Amy, you described. The institution stays on the way of this fiduciary and authorial professionalism. The question is it possible to make it in the service of that, and how you see it? Or it's impossible, and we need to just rethink, maybe it should be not based on institutions.
Yeah.
Maybe there should be no institution. Maybe school should not be institution.
And I think we can, those are interesting questions. And maybe we can look at the radical boundaries of possibilities there. First, let me answer this first question, is this institutionalist view compatible with teacher as a fiduciary agent? Is that at all possible? Let me describe an example where it can be compatible, that exists mostly in a fantasy, and then we can set that aside, okay? Where it can be compatible is where the teacher as a fiduciary agent is acting as such, and the institution is like, yes, that's exactly what we said you're supposed to do. And if in that amazing fantasy world happens, then there you have your compatibility, okay? I think that may be the real limits of that compatibility, because as soon as the teacher acting as a fiduciary agent moves in a direction with their beneficiaries away from the institutional program, the machinery, then that's the start of the incompatibility. Okay. Now, if we're also trying to deal with the realities of an organized civilization, society, what can we do to create a space that is good? If fiduciary agency is good, can we create institutions that support that? I think so, but there may be some question as to what degree that's supported. Do we have teachers just be completely freelance, where students are given essentially vouchers where they can select their teachers? Yeah, I think maybe that's the one radical side of that. That has its own kind of technical problems. Like, we have differences in the availability of teachers in different geographic areas, and the costs of providing those kinds of things in different geographic areas, and maybe some other factors that would end up.
Bryan, can I ask you, this is maybe less interesting for me, because what you start discussing that, because we need to think about what's ideal is, there could be so many questions, like, do we need resources for that? And you start discussing availability of people. That's another story, but how in principle it should look like, in principle.
Right. Well, I think should collides with the realities of what can be done. And so in theory, maybe that's the ideal. I think the realities of that, are much more complex.
I don't want, because this reality is very conservative view, because reality defines a given, and I actually invite you to transcend the given rather than being grounded in the given. Because this is it's like, imagine that we talk about, somebody said, slavery is bad. And the people say, no, we cannot live without slavery. How can economy, and it's collapsing, this idea that possibility to live without slavery. Because at that time, thinking about 200 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago, slavery was essential part of economy, let's say, in many places. not everywhere, but in many places. But think about let's think about how we can live without slavery. It will be immediately said, well, the practical issue required slavery. And you see, that's why I'm inviting you to transcend that given rather than be kind of grounded in the given. Because if you're grounded in the given, it's very difficult to transcend it.
Yeah. So we can do that. I mean, some of my hesitation to do that is ending up in its own kind of fatal theoreticism, right? Which these ideals can be.
It's always starting with some kind of dream, which is you can call it theoretism as much as you want, but this dream inspires people to make changes.
Right. I think that's the value of it.
Constantly grounded in the given, oppressive given, and you basically doing cosmetic things like how we can make slavery humane, more humane. And this is kind of this kind of approach, which is it's very questionable that you can make slavery humane. And the more you make slavery humane in a way, you make it less. It's even make it worse. Some people would say, because when it's in your face, it's much easier to confront that. When it becomes kind of sugarcoating.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's certainly some limitations to my research in terms of trying to say what's right and good to do. But I think one radical view is just that students can pick their teachers to the extent that they want to have their relationship with them.
It's very interesting. By the way, to think about alternative to the institution, school is institution, like Jim Reed model, nicely articulated, who is he's one of the founder of this Circle School, which is democratic school. And he nicely defined that as a scaled down society. So it's not institution, it's society. It's a completely different conceptualization of the school as a society rather than institution. By the way, it doesn't mean that as a society has some use of institutions within the society, but in the way how it's envisioned as a society and not as an institution. So I'm just giving you some idea. Okay, but thanks. That's good answer. You don't need to move, in my view, further.
Yeah. Okay.
Should we move next one, or you want some Diana or any comment on that?
I was just curious how choosing your teacher connected to professionalism.
Okay.
I don't know. I just find that sometimes I don't know what's good.
Right.
Like till I'm in the middle of it,
Yeah.
Like, would I have chosen Eugene's class? Or would I thought, oh my God, he's crazy. I can't be in that class. No, I don't know.
Yeah, I think as a professional, you there's no absolute guarantee or safety here. And as the beneficiary who's choosing your professional, you may pick the wrong teacher, just as you may pick the wrong doctor. But that decision rests with you. And your decision to continue that relationship as you make the discovery that they're the right or wrong person also rests with you as a beneficiary.
You kind of hit on something that bothers me when we study democratic education, and that is if 100% is left to the student, like if you never introduce something you're reading or a book or some idea or some topic, and it's always the student's choice.
Mm-hmm.
How is that good? I mean, I don't know. How is that good not to experience things? I guess that's my worry.
Yeah. And I think
when
that
students are choosing 100%, what experiences are they missing? And does it matter?
Right. I think that the short answer is that students will do a better job of it than the institution has. but I think that what was my point? It's something else that you sparked in me there. Oh, how are we defining good, right? And I think what's right and good can be defined in these institutional kinds of ways. And it can also be defined by the student too. And the institution can change and adapt, but it's a little more clunky in how that happens, whereas the student is much more fluid, to the point where that their decisions about what's right and good can even be viewed as whimsical, right? But I think as the student does that, they're taking responsibility for that. And that's the nature of the relationship between freedom and responsibility. They have the freedom, and ultimately they're responsible for what they decide they're doing with that freedom.
And I assume you're talking about a high school student?
No, I would extend this to all students. In my observations of the circle school and seeing 6-year-olds involved in the governance of that school, I think that they can be invited into that space. I think often those younger students are looking to the older students for guidance. And again, they're making decisions as to whether or not that's good guidance or not. If they're being asked, well, should we do this as a school? A 6-year-old might ask the older student, what does that mean? Or how do I even go about making that decision? Or they may discover the consequences of not doing that, right?
My answer, Bryan, you provided kind of what I call pragmatic and moral answer, but my answer is more conceptual. We don't have any choice, because this is, in my view, the difference between education and learning, which is usually nicely confused. But I say nicely because it's not innocent confusion between learning and education. But in my view, education is different from learning. That learning happens. Education is a judgment of only educatee, only the person, how good it is or bad it is or neutral that learning for them, which may change in the life. Like what you consider to be good suddenly become bad and vice versa. But it's just like, it's unescapable. The only person who can make that judgment is that person. Other people can help with this judgment or whatever, but they cannot impose on them. The only thing, again, it's a personal judgment, and what current so-called education, it's anti-education. What it's doing, it's robbing students from that judgment, engagement in that judgment. Even when you say, Diana, how to choose a good teacher, it's a great question. Unfortunately, it's not. It's a question without culture. We don't have culture of choosing teachers, because the teachers assign to the students. I'm kind of become a teacher, not because I'm a teacher, not because I'm useful, or they see me as useful. Yes, I maybe convince them that I'm useful, but in many cases they are not even, they don't need me, not because I'm useful or not useful, because they are not even the subject imposed on them that they not necessarily want to study, and they may be right in that.
That's Eugene. Some people do choose their teacher. They get their parent involved, and their parent goes to the guidance office.
I'm not saying that it's never happened. I'm just saying there is no culture of that. Like there is a culture of choosing doctors. By the way, I lived in Soviet Union when the doctors cannot be chosen. It's assigned to you, always assigned to you. And when I came to the United States, it's a little bit strange situation when you can't choose a doctor. How to choose a doctor? I don't know. You see, all of this, it's an interesting question. But in the United States, there is whole culture of choosing doctors. Like how to figure out, is it good doctor, reputation, networking, many other things to choose the doctors. And by the way, sometimes you're choosing very bad doctors, because what's the good doctor for one person is bad doctor for another person. That's another kind of story. Anyway, but the whole issue is very interesting, important. In my view, it's unescapable, because that's what, if we want to promote education and not learning, but education, there is no other way around. And it's a complicated question because in my view, like as my student said, I want you to make decisions, she asked me. And in this case, I'm making the decision about my education because I consider that your decisions are good. But that's kind of carte blanche that she giving me is conditional. At any time, she can then withdraw her consent. And in my view, this is where education is because she considers assessing me. Is it what I'm imposing even on her? Is it good or not? Because she wants me to impose on her. But only conditional, only because to the point when she likes it. When she doesn't like that, you say goodbye. And in my view, she's still making this important decision. She's still in the position of educatee, even if she gives me carte blanche and say, you can choose things and you can force me to do things, but only to the point that she likes that. As soon as she stops liking that, boom, goodbye, Eugene. And that's an interesting question. So my next question, Brian, if you okay to switch, and unless Amy, you want to jump on this topic, and we can, okay? It's about research and authorial professionalism.
There's something else I wanted to throw in at the risk of it being a pragmatic thing, Eugene. It's possible to make our existing institutions more supportive of teachers as fiduciary agents if we set boundaries and limitations to their invasion into that space. Okay. So I think that there's dealing with the institutions as they are, it's possible to do that. And I'm thinking of an administrator who has to come in and deal with the given institution. They may be able to they themselves not invade or remove the kinds of practices that are designed within the school that may invade into those spaces where professionalism and discretionary decisions are made for teachers acting as fiduciary agents.
What kind of boundaries? Can you give example of the boundary?
One is these teacher observations where the administrator comes in and tries to define what good teaching is, right? The administrator assumes the authority and tries to impose these technical ideologies on the practice of the teacher in the classroom.
Brian, can I stop you? Because in my view, I just need to say, coming from another practice, educational practice, Soviet Union, what you guys discussing sounds absolutely crazy to me. I'll tell you why. I just want to stop because, and it's part of that because you so much bounded by given, and you cannot see, in my view, absurdity of the situation. In Soviet Union, this observation can only be done, these professional observations, this different administrative observation can also happen, but I'll tell you what the difference is. But professional observation happens only by the special teacher who actually elected by other teacher in the district, who considered to be, it's called Methodist. Teacher Methodist, I don't know how to translate it better. It's literal translation, teacher Methodist. And it's considered the most respectful teacher within my area. Like, for example, I was teaching physics, so it was teacher of the physics. That teacher would come, and by the way, in my case, it was only by invitation. She said, I don't want to come people who don't want to be in the classrooms. So only by invitation. You come there, and she provided observations there and discussion. By the way, all this discussion started with very fiduciary. She was always asked, like, tell me how you see it, what you like, what you don't like, why you like it, what you don't like it, like what issue you're experiencing, like what advice you want ask for me. And then she became more open conversation about that. And she, by the way, also was a protector. Like, for example, Diana, she would become and said, you know, the noise coming from that classroom is very important. It's professional noise. It's a noise of learning, of education. And if somebody doesn't like that, well, we need to deal with it but the technical way, but we should not make a judgment that it's a bad teaching. Like, it's understandable that noise in one classroom can affect teaching in another classroom, but it's a technical issue. We need to figure out like how to do that. Maybe we should move classrooms, whatever. This is administration has to deal with that. But let me tell you, this is extremely important, and noise has to be there. Okay, so for example, by the way, it's this is a real example, by the way, and the way how they solved that problem, administration, they moved some of my classes to the last at the end of the day when in other classroom there was no lessons there in the classroom that I affected, and that administration tried to solve that. So, in my view, this idea that administration come and bring observations, it's very strange, coming from another national practice, institutional practice. I'm just saying that we need to think about that. Maybe the whole idea, like, why you need administrator in your classroom? Is that how helpful it is will be? Like administrator, think about that. Imagine that in the hospital, administrator comes to see, let's say, surgery. And make observation about that and make recommendations after that. This is a little bit bizarre. Like, who are you to come to my surgery and observe that? You're nothing to that. You're not a specialist in this area at all. What kind of advice what kind of judgment you can have? Like, you saw blood on the floor, so what? You see, or whatever. I'm just imagining. It's kind of considered to be, but in school it's okay. Some administrator can come and observe you and make, just because they're used to be teacher, maybe not used to be teacher, but they can be completely different area.
That's
like my principal in my Soviet school. In my Soviet school, she was a geographer. She was teaching geography, and she would come to me for completely different reasons. For her, it's most important this like discipline and stuff like that. But she would say, I cannot comment about your teaching of physics because I don't know much about it. No, I can give you but it's kind of stupid observations. I don't know much about this. But in the United States, it's like, that's why I'm saying it's absurdity for me to see that. And I'm prepared just because I had completely different practice that in my view makes much more sense than the United States.
All right, that's why I'm saying administrators shouldn't do that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. That's what you said. Good. Because I thought you'll start saying how they should do it better.
No.
Okay. Sorry, in this case, I raised my.
Right. I don't know. It's very interesting, Eugene, but that's.
Yeah, but irrelevant. Interesting, but irrelevant.
Right. So you had another question.
Yeah, another question that I'm asking about research in authorial professionalism, because the current educational research, exactly most of that, not all, but most of that try to focus exactly on technology of teaching, and then exactly to promote that technological professionalism. So what kind of research, and you're doing research by the way, so what kind of research can be useful for authorial fiduciary professionalism?
I guess the research that those authorial fiduciary professionals see as useful. I think that's the starting point, right? And if they want to look at research about how students' personality types help with student grouping and they find that useful to them, then great, go ahead. But please don't impose that on me. I'm not sure how else to answer that question. A lot of educational research is useless. If you look at what I had to do as a first-year teacher and you wanted to talk to me about student grouping, I'm more concerned about how do we put students in groups where they're not going to stab each other, right? Let's start there, okay? Because a lot of the research is just simply looking at the wrong things in my context. So I think as the fiduciary, I need to make some of those decisions. And possibly my students might even make some of those decisions if they want to decide they want to look at educational research or anything else they might want to bring to me, right? So does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, I think you at this beginning, because it's a huge thing. You can do dissertation on that issue in itself, but in a way, nonetheless, it's kind of, what I'm thinking about is kind of implications of your research. It's kind of discussion, kind of so what?
Yes.
And this is one of the interesting consequences of what.
Yeah. Well, then I can highlight one of the problems. You look at this learning focused schools. This is coming from this external research.
Exactly.
It's bad. It's bad. In theory, it's good. In terms of making money for marketing this to administrators, they're successful. And therefore, if you want to define good in that way, it's good. But if you really look at the classroom, and if I want to take it to my classroom, it's bad. And I can articulate and have articulated why it's bad. So, as the professional, please don't impose that on me.
And a lot of research, even about grouping and all that stuff, it's very, again, the problem is that you teachers dealing with particular situations, and in many ways, you can argue even further, unique situations. And what kind of research can help that? Because this averaging and universaling, because research, usually positivistic research, it's about universals.
Oh, yeah.
And or averaging, which is universals, which is maybe like on average it may be this way, but in particular case, it's this averaging doesn't help much.
Yeah. So here's how I make sense of the value of that research. One is often it's not valuable just simply because of that. It's trying to universalize things, whereas I'm dealing with the particulars. But it can be valuable in the sense that it provokes me to think about something. But then in that provocation, I'm free to regard it or disregard it. And I think that's important. I think positivistic researchers wouldn't like that answer, because I think they're trying to establish some kind of absolute truth. And they're also claiming authority on that. Whereas a professional, I'm reclaiming that authority and saying, no, I'll determine if it's true or not. I'll determine if it's valuable or not. Thank you very much.
Sounds like they're more interested in dialogic research rather than positivistic research, which is exactly aiming and provoking people for further discussions, for further dialogue.
Right. And I think that goes back to, Diane, what you're talking about with community. I think that's the professional community. I think that's an important part of professionalism, is that honest conversation about what's happening in our classrooms and what we should be doing, and this constant question about what's good, what's not good. And that question is never finalized and answered. It's part of an ongoing dialogue among professionals. If you notice, one of my other points was that professionals act as advocates for the profession itself. I think professionals need to defend those discretionary spaces when those discretionary spaces are good to have. It's quite possible that some professions may come and go throughout history because the profession is no longer good. So I think when I say that, I think professionals need to advocate for the profession when they, in their critical dialogue with each other, still see that it is good to do so. And that includes the professional practice and what that practice is.
My final question, again, I'm waiting if Amy or Diana wants to say something. By my final question, which is, again, we're already discussing that, but I just want maybe you to summarize maybe the discussion. It's about back to the ideal relationship between administration and authorial/fiduciary professionalism or professionals. Like, what's the ideal relationship should be in your view? Well, we already know one thing: they should not do observations. That's one thing.
Right.
But this is what they should not. The question is what they should not do and what they should do. If you can think about it.
Yeah.
And what the relationship should be, because right now administration is boss and the professionals are their employees, which need to please them. And this is destroy the notion of professionalism, because in a way professionals is you need to serve your students, not to the administrators.
Right.
Yeah. So talk about that.
Right. So if we can establish that the teacher's acting as a fiduciary agent for the student, then in my view, it becomes beholden upon the administrators to respond to the teachers who are acting as his fiduciary agents for the benefit of the students. And the administrators should take guidance from the teachers in terms of what to do. So if you look at how administrators are currently doing it with this technical compliance of teachers, administrators may need to become more technically compliant to teachers. For teachers to say, my lights aren't working, you need to fix that. Okay. Make sure that the buses run on time, make sure the building's organized, and solve those kind of logistical administrative kind of concerns as they're identified in the professional community as advocates for the students. So to what extent students may also be defining what needs to be done too. So that the details of that,
No, the details we don't need that, but there is
I don't got them,
conceptual issues. There is some conceptual. This is understandable about like lights, and cleanness, and something like that.
Or even if we have to have administrators, right? This is so you're asking what to do with them. I mean, it's possible we don't have administrators, right? There's some you can have, particularly with online, things like that. We may have teaching relationships that don't involve an administrator at all. So that. Yeah, so there's can be many different things that administrators are, and administrators may, they might. It's not that they become mindless zombies, or they may become problem solvers in their own right, and they may develop very acute sensitivities to what is happening with students and teachers, and this may make them very good administrators, right? They may start to solve problems without teachers telling them what to do. Those are all possibilities.
Right. Well, part of that it's administrators or administrative tasks involve negotiation between like even practice and reality check, and which is not easy things, because reality check is. Let me give example at the university level. Like people, administrators creating schedules, right? But the schedules itself can. Part of that, they're interested in thinking about spaces, rooms, and whatever, which is limited at the university level, right? And they have to negotiate that, but their decisions, technical decisions, can affect practices, pedagogical practices of the professors, and in terms of like many things. And sometimes administrators takes completely different wrong priorities. Like, for example, they try to make efficient use of the space. Well, I always when I hear that, I'm always returned back that the mission of university is not involve efficient use of space. This is not written in the mission of the university. The mission of the university is about providing teaching or education, research, and service. It's not talks about efficiency. If efficiencies happen, that's good, but it's definitely not a priority. But it's very clear, very quickly become priority suddenly.
Right, and it seems to me like that kind of language is the way administrators seize control and justify their actions, right? And they justify having control. Is somehow this efficiency is in service to those other needs, right? Yeah, right, and often it isn't. But the thing is that it shifts the power of the decision making into the administrators. If we go, okay, well, we need efficiency, right? Or okay, this makes rational sense. All of these things in the whole system is built upon some kind of rational argument, right? And it's very convenient because there's these singular truths, right? There's this belief that all students should be able to do this, or we conduct some kind of rational study that says this is how you get students to do this most efficiently. And this is how classrooms should be set up or schools should be set up. It could be efficiency, 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 and it's all instrumental towards specifically defined goals.
In my view, the question becomes like, what I would like to have, that administration comes to me or us and said, how can we help you? Rather than what they do now, which constantly dictate us, this has to be placed, and we want to tell you that you cannot teach on Monday and Tuesday, because it's more convenient for us to create that schedule what we create.
Right.
Because it can be only Monday and Wednesday and Friday, but not Monday and Tuesday. Or the class meetings should be this amount of time and not anything else, because you know that machinery will collapse of that. Instead of thinking, well, we have computers, they can actually fix that problem. Yeah, it used to be very difficult when you're doing by hands, but now the computers can solve them. They can create this many possibilities. You put constraints, put desires, and they try to think. Or computer might say, you know what, it's impossible. Okay, in this case, it's understandable, it's impossible. But right now, it's nothing to do about, nobody even testing. Is it possible or not possible?
Yeah, I think there's a certain kind of administrative egocentrism, right? In terms of how they view.
But the question is, the question, because it's hierarchy right now, it allows that possibility is very easy. So the question is how to make sure that there is not that hierarchy. How to ensure the relationship with administration, like things, for example. Let me give another example. It never happened, at least I never experienced, that janitor will come in the middle of my class and start cleaning the room because it's more convenient, it's more efficient for them to clean it in this particular time. They will not even get to their mind that it's possible. This even thought, although it may be true, by the way, maybe it is more efficient to clean the room at that particular time. But they will not come to their mind. But for administration, it will come. The question is, and it's not because people are janitors are smarter than administrators. Something that creates that stupidity in a way, in the air. So what it is and how to kind of destroy that?
Yeah.
Any ideas?
I know I've thought about this before. It's so culturally embedded, and it seems like a phenomenon of modern and even pre-modern hierarchical societies, right?
No, my feeling is a part of that, which is we get back to the issue that we discussed about students hiring. It's who is hiring, who is defining money issues, all of that. That's important. That creates power.
Yeah, absolutely. Those things do. And they're also symptoms of the power too, because you can rationalize why administrators should do all of those things as well. So there's those obvious things like shift power into these other places. And then you don't have, because janitors aren't in a powerful position. They don't interfere in the classroom at that point. They recognize that that's the important thing going on, and they're going to have to figure out how to work around that, right? Administrators are in the powerful position, and they may very well come interfere with your classroom because they don't have to have regard for it, because they have the power not to have regard for it. So yeah, shifting power and all those different things that are associated with that power to other places would destroy that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because my feeling gets power first, discourse second, rather than the other way around. It's first they created this, and then they justify that, rather than they justify and then it created.
Yeah, I think there's certainly an interrelationship between those things. But once the power has consolidated its power, they command that narrative. And maintaining command of that narrative becomes really important. And you can see that in my observation. You know, they need to say somehow I'm a marginal teacher, that my teaching is bad. So let's talk about those things in the written evaluation as opposed to everything that was good that was happening. Because what I wrote was problematic, right? I was attacking the ideology. So therefore I can't be a good teacher, and the theory wins. So maintaining that narrative becomes really important to maintaining power. But if the narrative changes, power may change as well. Power changes, narrative may change, right? So I think there's an interrelationship between those things.
No, there is interrelationship, but I think that the primary thing is power. But maybe I'm wrong about that. What we're doing, by the way, what your dissertation might be doing is exactly changing the discourse.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, I'm taking the theory and having it on a collision with realities that I'm articulating. And I think that's why I was a threat to that administrator as well. So,
you know, I think it's interesting. I think power is built by students also, or determined by students, because you mentioned students have gone through your class and they have been students of administrators who have the power. and it has somehow shifted some power towards you. And so I think sometimes we forget students are the subject of education. They're the person we serve, and they do wield a lot of power. It's not sometimes observable power, you know?
Yeah. But sometimes it is too. You know, and I think this is why administrators may be anxious to control students, right? And control teachers so that students are controlled, because those teachers are very dangerous. I mean, the students are very dangerous.
Right.
It's possible they may realize their power and do something with it. I can think of one example. This was several years ago. I was advisor to a club called the Social Action Club, which so this was like 2004, 5, 6, 7. Students wanted to organize awareness about LGBTQ issues and make the school safer, more open place. So they organized a day of silence, which the students would wear like a black T-shirt and not speak, to symbolize what it's like to be closeted. And there's somewhat of a community uproar about this. And people were complaining to the school board. The school board would start screaming at administrators. And even though I don't think we had great administrators then, I have to give credit to my teacher. He shouldered a lot of that, but some of it would get passed down to me. And then I would shoulder some of that to protect my students. And I didn't tell my students what to do, but I could say, you can contact the ACLU and find out about your rights. And so they would do that. And they became very much aware of what they wanted. They were very much aware they didn't want this issue dissolved into some kind of global acceptance get together. They wanted to specifically talk about LGBTQ students. They had research that showed that if you're going to be effective in addressing this issue, you have to address it specifically. And they were able to articulate this, and they were able to state, this is our rights to do it, and we're going to do that. And they couldn't be controlled because of essentially another institution, which is these laws that exist. But they're able to leverage that against the school institution. And it was very dangerous for anybody who was involved with that, right? Maybe less so for the students because they were protected, right? Yeah. Anything else?
So now, Brian, I think we need to leave, and Amy and Diana and I, we need to decide whether or not we will award your degree. So,
That's fine with me.
by the way, in this case, any advice, Amy and Diane, because this is Brian's actually dissertation presentation. I don't know if you realize that.
No.
I haven't written a dissertation yet, but
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I think probably the people you work with on your committee are more knowledgeable about different types of professionalism, but for me, that would have helped a little bit in the beginning, but I don't know who your audience is going to be. So we were probably a different audience than the one you would have at your dissertation. I don't know.
Probably. We're all unique individuals, right? Yeah, no doubt. I don't know what they would have to say. I don't know what their background is in professionalism itself, that like word. In my own research, there isn't, that word's not nailed down well.
I don't think so, because to me, it's like a code of conduct. And who decides on this code of conduct? You know, you yourself decide on a code of conduct. Your technological, so your organization, where you come from, they decide on a code of conduct. Your institution or your authority decides on a code of conduct. So for me, I had to really think about, well, what are the different types of professionalism?
Yeah, right. And as you pointed out, these codes of conduct are often not clearly defined where they come from. Yeah, so I don't know.
And the question, of course, the biggest question what you're raising, is it codifiable in the first place?
Right.
Like, for example, we constantly think about some profession when we discuss that, but one profession is like, for example, artists or actors or writers. Do they have, they're definitely professions. Do they have codes of the profession? No. And they're creative professions. And the question is, what should be teaching model after more technical professions, or should we model more after creative professions? And I think we should do the kind of the later. To more focus on creative professions rather than technical professions.
Right. That's an interesting comparison, right? The technical versus artistic. So, you know, what is
creative? I'm not saying artistic, creative.
Sorry?
I would say creative
rather than artistic. I would put creative more important than
right,
artistic.
creative.
Because they can be creative and non-artistic.
Define it though.
Yeah, right.
I think creative try to define it. For example,
okay, go ahead.
So for example, if I am behaving professionally in a creative field, can I disparage you for your creativity? Can I say your creativity is wrong? Can I say your view of the world is wrong and still be professional?
Some people say you can, and some people say you cannot, and there is no consensus about that.
I don't know. To be an artist, sometimes there is consensus about something.
No, there is not. Diane, it means you are in bubble, in creative bubble. There is a lot of strong people, by the way, some of them look like very narcissistic, who make it very easily to make judgments about that. And some other, which is more gentle people who say, you know what, this is your area, you like that and fine with you. But, you know, I'm on my, and I don't
Now you're talking about a personal professionalism. You're talking about a personal code of professionalism. You're telling me the field has no code of conduct. The field has no professionalism.
Some of those things emerge. I'm thinking like, I was watching an actor who was being interviewed by, you know, David Letterman's doing these kind of interviews now where he hangs out with someone who's like famous and they just have conversations. And he was talking to an actor, and he was talking about how he was working on some sets in LA, and he found that when he was young, some of the lead actors wouldn't rehearse things with him. And he said, you know what, as I develop in my profession, maybe assume lead actor roles, I'm not going to do that. I am going to rehearse with other people. And so there's some conversation with him and possibly others, and certainly some being invited on this interview with Letterman as to what is it like to be a good actor? What should you be doing? And there again, you may have some disagreement with that, but I think there's a community that's engaged in dialogue, and they will talk to each other about that. Say, you know what, it is common practice to do this. And if you're going to say you're going to deviate from that, okay, take responsibility and voice why, and let people address you in that. Or, you know, maybe the community says, okay, this is common practice and I want to do this. This is why this is valuable. And we as a community have talked about that. And as a professional, I share that view, or I don't, and here's why. Right. So I think that there again, it's not clear what the end result is. This professionalism is a defined thing, but there's this kind of dialogic space in which it's happening. And that's among these creative professions. Like, what is this good for us, our own health? Is this good for the final product, the end result, the performance? Are these two things interrelated? And if to what extent are they, or to what extent should one be sacrificed for the other? And I think those are these ongoing dialogic issues that are happening.
Like
there again, that's in that creative space, right?
Right.
Yeah. And there is big debates among actors about whether or not acting is a technique or is it a way of living your life. And it's a huge debate, and it's very inconclusive. There is no consensus about that, and some actors do it one way, some another, and some maybe zillions other ways. But
or they may do it all at different times, right?
Yeah, right, and they may change their mind, whatever. And that's a lovely profession. Like, for example, there is the fact that Leo Tolstoy, which is a very well-recognized classical writer, he thought that Shakespeare was a terrible writer, and that's okay. I mean, some people agree, but some disagree. Okay. And by the way, all of these famous writers and actors, from the fact that they're excellent in one piece of art, doesn't predict that they will be good on the next one. You see, which is exactly shows that there's not necessarily code of conduct. You would say they should know how they can make it something that it doesn't look like good. It happened. Because
the code of conduct. So the code of conduct you're describing, you're still describing one. You're describing this flexibility.
You can call about that, but it's become useless almost because you almost like when it's absent. There is no basically writers. Everyone will tell you. Tell me, it's not about what you like with the artists with. Painters, especially with the people who involved in this art, can be very interesting. Like piece of this one can be art and can be not art. You see, so it's not about conduct. It's orientation.
It's about being open to accepting that, whether you believe it or not.
Being open is not. It's not a code of conduct. By the way, being open. Because opposite will be true as well. Because in some cases it may be not open. You see, I think for each you will find opposite, and it will be true as well.
And I think that art is often about transcendence. Otherwise, it's reproduction.
Yeah, exactly. Right? It's creative. That's why I'm saying it's creativity. That's why code of conduct is constantly given. It's something that's stable, and creativity is constantly transcends that. It's, by the way, it's using that. It's not like it's rejecting that concept. It's not rejecting. It's using that as a material but it transcends that. That's as soon as you put something stable, it's move on. It's like Woody Allen point about sharks.
To me, you're describing one type of professionalism.
Exactly. Exactly. No. And the question is it teaching more like that? Or teaching more like plumbing.
Yeah, and that's an interesting idea. Looking at
you're absolutely right there. This is one way, and the question is which way is teaching, or like educational practice. My feeling is educational practice is more on creativity side rather than on technical side. And of course, creativity side also has technical aspect, but it's only aspect.
And where does charisma fit in? Because there's definitely an element of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's interesting to consider.
Yeah, it is.
So, Dr. Amy, what's your
I guess I'm left thinking, like, where do you go from here? Like, given the situation and thinking about all the things that you have, like, what would be the next steps, or what would be your advice for like a project of possibility? You know, like what could we do to move to action from this information that you've gathered or your experience? And one of the things that I kind of heard like a theme throughout was the machine of
Yeah.
schooling and efficiency. It sounded very like it sounded very industrial, and maybe that's a leftover from the Industrial Revolution. Maybe we're trying to industrialize everything, including how we do schooling. And maybe it's time to reimagine that, that we're moving into a new era. And I don't know, like there's so much here, so many good things to go.
And when I'm hearing you say that, I think like it involves shedding the machinery, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the machinery is now in the way. The
Right.
machinery that used to solve a problem and serve a function is now in the way.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the way almost taking over, like in being as a useful tool that can help solve complicated problems, it takes over and becomes almost another oppressor.
Yeah.
Right.
And if you go back to storytelling, I mean, that's a theme in so many of these, science fiction movies where
Like the Terminator movies are all about.
the AI, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, so it's
Warning.
it's like our schools have become the Terminator.